And okay, there. We are now live. Yeah, you may begin, Dr. Pawlik.
Thank you very much. Okay, hello everyone. Greetings from the DSA-ASIA laboratory. Thank you all for your interest in our archaeology webinar series and for joining us today for another exciting talk on the deep human history. As always, this webinar is jointly hosted and facilitated by Aido Balboa, Dr. Riczar Fuentes, and myself. This webinar series is supported by the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and its members, the School of Social Sciences, Areté, the Creativity and Innovation Hub of the Ateneo de Manila University, and the Eduardo J. Aboitiz Sandbox Zone. So today we have the great pleasure to have Dr. Glenn Summerhayes of the University of Otago as our speaker. Professor Summerhayes has held the chair in anthropology at the University of Otago in New Zealand since 2005. Prior to that, he was the head of archaeology and natural history at the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies of the Australian National University. Professor Summerhayes is an honorary professor at both the Australian National University and the University of Queensland, and he has been actively involved in Papua New Guinea archaeology for over 40 years. For his distinguished service and his contribution to the archaeology of New Guinea, he was confirmed in the 2014 New Year's Honours listings as an officer of the Order of Logohu of Papua New Guinea. Just this year, in 2021, he was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for his contribution to tertiary education and history. Glenn is also a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, Fellow of the Linnean Society of London, and a Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain. Dear Glenn, thank you very much for being with us today, and I now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Alfred. I would like to thank Alfred Pawlik for inviting me here to present this talk. It was so many months ago, I forgot all about it till last week. But it's a pleasure being here, and I'm looking forward to presenting some new data on the archaeology of New Guinea. I'm just trying to get this. Here we go. I work in the Pacific, and I work in the Western Pacific. And the Western Pacific has a great story to tell about human endeavor and the colonization of nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Papua New Guinea, where I work, the first footsteps of humanity were felt in New Guinea over 50,000 years ago. And we see this in the highland valleys of Papua, in the Ivani Valley. But today's talk, I want to look at Austronesian movement, the movement of people into the Pacific and the models that account for those people and the role that Papua New Guinea plays in that movement. Here we have an illustration of people, the conventional model of Austronesian movements of people out of Taiwan into the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and through island Southeast Asia, skirting New Guinea, and then coming into the Bismarck Archipelago. I'll have more maps later. And also a movement through Micronesia, which I'll talk about later. The point of this graph is that the movement of peoples is a large-scale event, eventually reaching New Zealand only 800 years ago. The Lapita movement occurs in Papua New Guinea in the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Lapita movement refers to the first colonization of areas east of the Solomons. As I said, people have been in Papua New Guinea and near Oceania, the area to the end of the Solomon chain, over 50,000 years ago. But past that chain, past the Solomons, into Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Tonga, Samoa, that occurred much more recently, around 3,000, 3,100 years ago. And the spread from west to east was the first colonization of these areas east of the Solomons. And they left the Bismarck Archipelago, the islands of New Britain, New Ireland, Manus. And these earliest Lapita settlements in the Bismarcks are around 3,300 to 3,100. We use the term 3,300, but 3,300 is really the end of a standard deviation of radiocarbon dates. It's any time between 3.3 and 3.1. And then eventually into Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Tonga over a period of a couple of hundred years, perhaps even less. And the people, as they moved out, basically colonized. Most of their settlement patterns are on beaches. They had a translocated environment. They took with them agriculture, domesticated animals. They had strong communication networks from the populations that they left. And pottery is a marker of this settlement going across, what we call Lapita pottery, highly dentate, tattooed markings on the pots. More on this in a minute. These are the ancestors of the present-day populations of most of the Pacific. In the Bismarcks, Lapita lasts nearly 1,000 years. Some people would dispute that, whereas in remote Oceania, the pottery and material culture changes quite quickly. And there are reasons for that that, if given a chance, I might talk about later. Here are some of the ceramics. Now, the dentate pottery that you see in front of you basically is over 500 motifs from New Guinea across to Samoa. These dentate ceramics, these tattooing of the pots, are basically found only on a select number of vessel forms, bowls, stands. They're basically non-utilitarian. They're not your cooking ware. In a Lapita assemblage, half the pots we find are plainware cooking vessels or water containers. We might find a third of them with linear incision, carinated jars with charcoal. I mean, these are for the everyday water and cooking. This dentate stuff you see here, that you see in most of the textbooks, only applies to maybe 30 or 35% of the assemblage at most. And it applies to the pottery that is non-utilitarian, probably used in ritual of some sort. You look at some of these dentate motifs, it looks like a computer generated some of them. These are all between 3,300 and 3,100 years old from the island of Kumgot, from the site of Kumgot on the island of Babassi in the Anear Island group off the east coast of New Ireland. These are ceramics excavated by Chris Gosden from the Areté. You've got pottery from different parts of the Bismarck Archipelago, similar in shape, similar in form, changing at the same pace. And over time, decoration becomes less labor intensive. Some of the pottery is definitely a lot looser. This one on the bottom right on the island of Maklo in the Areté. I remember digging the site, and after 2 weeks we found nothing. And on the last bucket from the last excavation, this is what we found. And you can see the marking, the line where the artisan has put to guide the dentate, and then all of a sudden something happened and it stopped. So over time, the dentate becomes much more open, less labor intensive. And this reflects, I think, changes in the society as well. The point I want to make here is that the Lapita occupation in the Bismarck Archipelago and in other parts of the Pacific, when you excavate a Lapita site like Anear, for instance, Kumgot, in a 1x1 you'll find 2,500 bits of pottery, 500 pieces of obsidian. These pieces here are from Gower Island, excavated by Dr. Robin Torrance of the Australian Museum. See, we're getting shell impressed coming in later on, was never found in the earlier material. So from the Bismarck Archipelago, we have Lapita sites from all places, from southwest New Britain to New Ireland. We have a lot more than this map shows. And the changes that are occurring are changes at the same pace within these sites, indicating some form of interaction between these communities. And we find tens of thousands of pieces of pottery in these consumer sites. The sites are found pretty much a little bit inland, because when they were originally occupied, they were reef villages over these reef low energy locations. And then over time, the land covered them up, so you have pristine preserved material. That's important. Low energy environments, reef platforms. We're finding the sites today. More on this later. So they spread across eventually to Tonga, where they stopped, and Samoa, where pretty much the occupation stopped, the progression stopped for some period of time before the advance continued. And when they went with them, they brought with them their whole translocated environment. And here they brought the humble chicken, the rat, Pacific rat, the dog, and the pig. So they actually brought the whole kit and caboodle, their whole fridge with them, and food and tree crops as well, yams, taro, and so on. But there's a lot more artifacts that they manufactured that we see in these sites. This is again from Kumgot. I know Pat Kirch, his excavations at Talapaka Malai on the Musau group have equivalent material that has been found. A variety of different fish hooks. This particular fish hook on the bottom left is the only fish hook that I know of where you have a tang. This was excavated from Emerald, a team that I led to Emerald, dug up by Dr. Ann Ford. Beautiful piece. It's as if someone made it on the stilt house, dropped it into the water, into the sand. The chances of refining it are next to nil. And over 3,000 years, the sand covers it up to be excavated in 2007. So a rich cultural repertoire. Obsidian, black volcanic glass from the known sources in Manus in the Admiralties, from New Britain, Ferguson Island, and so on. Now, the Manus and the New Britain material is the obsidian going all the way across to Fiji, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, with the earliest explorers. It's also found west to Borneo, northern Borneo, and I believe some pieces have been found as surface collections in the southern Philippines. This is a 6,000 kilometer distribution. Now, why would you ship obsidian to Borneo when it has its own obsidian? Is the only model one can think of is that it's epiphenomenal to other social mechanisms, that it went along as unaccompanied baggage to these regions. But connections are there. And we can get these young archaeologists to do chemical analysis and petrographic analysis on the Lapita pottery and to construct models of production, which we can use to start to model interaction and the nature of development over time. Now, these have been published elsewhere, and I do not want to get into more detail about this, but we have a wealth of material about the Lapita development within the Bismarck archipelago, let alone its movement into New Caledonia, the great work of Christoph Sand, into Vanuatu, Stuart Bedford and Matthew Spriggs with the National Cultural Centre, into Fiji and Tonga and Samoa. And new discoveries are being made every year. Dave Burley in Fiji and Tonga is fantastic to watch. But the models to account for this development of Lapita are varied and disputed. The most common model is that Lapita or Austronesian speakers of the past would have emigrated, or movement began out of China into Taiwan, down through the Philippines, and then skirting the coast of New Guinea, entering the Bismarck archipelago, and then developing the Lapita cultural complex within the Bismarcks. So the ancestral connection is coming through over 1,000 or more years. Recently, another model has been put forward by Carson, Hung, Summerhayes, and Bellwood to argue that also another movement through the Philippines into the Marianas into the Bismarck archipelago. Now, I heard someone say, oh, they didn't come from there. You know, what are you saying? They're not from Southeast Asia. Listen, what we're arguing is that it's a two-pronged approach into the Bismarcks. I can confidently say Lapita pottery has not been found in Southeast Asia. Similar forms have been found, but they're a bit later in time. It's a bit like making a cake. You're getting the recipes from here, the recipes from there, and so ingredients from two separate places, and you mix them together, and that's where Lapita forms within the Bismarck archipelago. with antecedents from other regions. But this model also assumes that there was no occupation on the north coast. As Matthew Spriggs pointed out a few years back, I think Stuart Bedford did as well with Christoph Sand, if people did come from island Southeast Asia, you would have had to find somewhere some evidence, some signature of Lapita along the north coast of New Guinea. Now we have a problem, and the problem is this. The prime Lapita sites we're finding in the Bismarck Archipelago and other areas are in environments that are low energy, reef platforms, gentle environments. The north coast of New Guinea, from the New Guinea border onwards, is one of the most high energy, violent landscapes you can imagine. In Wewak, across the Areté, there are no offshore reefs. All the way down to Madang, where you might start to think about getting some low inert environments. The problem here, however, is down near Madang in eastern New Guinea, you're having a string of volcanoes offshore with massive damage to the mainland. And I've worked in Madang with Dylan Gaffney at Bilbil and also on Kawakau Island. And on mainland around Madang, we came to the realization that the coast 3,000 years ago is where the current highway is, about 3 or 4 kilometers inland. The rest has been uplifted with these dramatic volcanic eruptions. So where are you going to find these beautiful low energy environments for the preservation of these early Austronesians? Where are you going to find these early signatures? I doubt if you'll find them on the coast on the mainland. Roger Green also argued that when people did move into the Bismarck Archipelago to define the Lapita cultural complex, he introduced what he calls the 3 I's. There was innovation, integration, and intrusion, giving the Bismarck Archipelago Lapita its unique flavor. Let's get back to this north coast. The north coast is an area that must have some signature of occupation. Now, we do find Lapita on the south coast of Papua New Guinea. The fantastic excavations from Monash University, led by Professor Ian McNiven, just to the west of Port Moresby, which has totally rechanged the textbooks. But the pottery they're finding and the occupation is what I call the middle Lapita, around 2,900. It's not the earlier stuff. It's pretty much occupied at the same time that people are going to the east, to Tonga and Samoa. So let's address the north coast. New research has turned the conventional model of occupation on its head. I want to have a look at first exchange with mainland New Guinea between 3,300 and 3,100. I want to have a look at the island of Coil off the mainland coast of New Guinea. And then I want to have a look at some new finds of pottery occupation, pottery sites in the interior of New Guinea that are either being published or impressed or about to be published. First, we know that occupation and interaction, we know interaction has occurred between the Bismarck Archipelago and mainland PNG. And we know that because when I was excavating the site of Emerald, the local school teacher who had also undertaken excavations showed us this jadeite gauge or chisel. And straight away, it was unique. I've never seen one like it. We get greenstone, we get nephrite in some places, but we send it off to Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and they analyzed it as jadeite, the rarer form of jade, not nephrite. And up until then, I thought, well, where's the nearest jadeite sources? You've got Japan, you've got Burma, and that's about it. And I spoke to Hugh Davies, who was professor of geology at the University of Papua New Guinea, and he wrote most of the geological reports for New Guinea. Hugh's just retired and living in Canberra. And he said, yeah, you get jadeite in the mineral assemblages, but it's minute, nothing like this. We did some trialing through the internet, and we found that the Dutch were in West Papua during a scientific expedition, one of the expeditions in the 1880s, 1890s, and the geologists collected some greenstone from just northwest of Lake Santani, did wet chemistry, and this was very similar to what we had. George Harlow, who we'd been subsequently working with at the Smithsonian, one of the world's leading experts on jade, also undertook probe analysis, and through Hugh Davies connections, and only Hugh Davies connections, we were able to get some of the original greenstone collected by these Dutch explorers from the 1890s from Holland. George Harlow did a comparison, and yep, they were a direct match. This material, this jadeite, is coming from just west of Lake Santani. That's a distance of 922 kilometers. I spoke to Pierre Petrican. Now, Pierre is one of the world's leading experts on nephrite in Europe, but also in West Papua. And I told him about the results, and he was astounded because most of the greenstone around Santani in the west is nephrite. But he did talk about a source in the interior that he couldn't go into, pretty much the same area where this material came from. Problem is, you don't find one piece of jade that moves 900 odd kilometers. There must be others. And this reflects on the paucity, the lack of excavations, the lack of archaeological research along the north coast of West Papua or Irian Jaya. And I'm hoping that the next generation of archaeologists can somehow break that barrier to get permission to work on the north coast of Irian Jaya, because I think it's there that major discoveries will be made that can help answer the questions that we're posing in this lecture. So we know that there is definite connections between mainland New Guinea across to the Bismarck Archipelago. People didn't skirt the area. And these are in context of 3,300 to 3,000 years ago. The second example I want to talk about is the island of Coil. Now, Coil is one of the Schouten Island group, about 60 kilometers off the coast of Wewak. And I started a project there while I was still at the ANU. And we did work on Coil. Subsequently, we did work on Vokia and also Way. But it's Coil I want to talk about. Prior to our work on Coil, what was the evidence of Lapita on mainland New Guinea? Now, I mentioned Lapita on the south coast, but it's a later presence, although some remarkable finds. Yet very little from the north coast. We had what we call the Areté sherd, found by Lisk, who was an amateur archaeologist based up on the north during the Second World War, who collected a piece and took it back to Australia, and then collected from his collections after his death. And here it is here. It's definitely Lapita. It's middle Lapita in design. We have a piece of supposedly Lapita, and I have no reason to argue why it's not. I think it is. I think John Terrell was right. It is dentate Lapita from Ali Island, just next to Tumlia, off Areté. Now, he published that in Antiquity going back to 1997, and that's it. So we've got little bits of evidence that it's there, but not much. 2003, I started a program of research along the north coast of New Guinea, and I was concentrating on Coil Island. We have an article that we're writing, we're about to submit, and with myself, the late Peiwa Wu, one of my PhD students who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. Herman Mandui, the late Herman Mandui, who is the Deputy Director of the National Museum and Art Gallery of Papua New Guinea, who unfortunately passed away in 2014. Matt Leaversley, who is the lecturer, the leading archaeologist at the University of Papua New Guinea. Tepsi Beni, a student from the University of Papua New Guinea, the first female student to do her fourth year honours project in archaeology. Ben Shaw, who's a research fellow at the ANU, and the late Bill Dickinson, who was the doyen of petrography in the Pacific, one of the world's greatest geologists. So we do have an article that eventually will be submitted. Getting back, here's Coral Island. It's a remarkable place, 60 kilometers off the coast. You go in a little canoe going out there. I want to concentrate on this particular site called Wirar on the north coast. I had been doing research over there for a number of years, pretty much excavated the whole region. Then on the last trip back to give the results to the community, I was shown this little enclave on the north coast that I didn't know existed, and we excavated it and we found some remarkable pottery. Getting to Coil, this is a remarkably rare scene of very flat sea. If the sea was like this all the time, I'd be a very happy person. 2 hours to get over in this little banana boat. Unfortunately, most times the seas are not like this. So you pretty much bunker down with your coffee and a raincoat. Coil you can see just in the distance like a little pancake. The island is remarkable. It's an Austronesian-speaking island. This is the late Chief Matthew Boyek. He was the paramount chief. This island here, in the old days, you walked below the chief. Unfortunately, a lot of people who have never worked in PNG tend to think somehow that Papua New Guinea is all big man society. It is not. These coastal areas are all Austronesian. This area here, and also Emerald, where I worked off Musau, had a high chief. And you walk beneath them. And even today, if the high chief says something, then you do it. What's also remarkable here in these islands is they speak, of course, Austronesian languages, although they are adapting some cultural traits from non-Austronesian mainland communities which they interact with. But what I was quite amazed at is we took a colleague of mine, Matt Preble, with us, and Chief Matthew asked him to do a haka. And as Matthew's doing a New Zealand haka, kamate, kamate, his Chief Matthew next to me translating it, look at me, look at me. The languages share similarities that basically originated from their common origin. Kamate, mate, the eye. Same as the New Ireland, matem kupkum, matem bek, matem, the eye. The word for 5 in these regions is rua. So very similarities across New Guinea all the way out back to New Zealand because they share a common ancestry. Coil was also part of a large exchange network. This is taken from the northeast coast of Coil. You can see the offshore islands, and these form a chain that you follow all the way down to New Britain, then across to New Ireland, and again down to Bougainville. Each island here had its own speciality. Coil had a couple of specialities. One of them was gallop nut or canarium. One of the sites I dug, Gomagon Cave, back in 2003 or 4, we did recover canarium nut in context that dated to the late Pleistocene. I think it was about 13,000. And we're waiting for a publication with Andrew Fairbairn, professor at the University of Queensland. So we do have early occupation here, probably a pit stop on their way to Manus. But Wirar is the area I want to concentrate on. And briefly, I just want to point out that there's a sequence, a stratigraphy here of high energy events. And within each, we have ceramics and obsidian, not much obsidian and not many ceramics, but from these series of events, all dating sequentially up the site. So we're not looking at a low inert environment. We're not looking at someone dropping a piece of pottery to be found 3,000 years later in pristine condition. We're looking at an occupation site with high turnover from the seas. This is a high energy environment, but we are getting pottery from the lowest levels. Now, depending on which delta factor you want to actually use, we've got pottery definitely around 3.1, 3,000. If we directly date the charcoal, we're getting to about 3.6 to 3.3, but as we don't know the type of charcoal it is, the tree it originates from, we'll go to the burnt coral, and we've got pretty good advice on that. We're looking at least 3.1 to 3,000. And by the way, further up in the site, around 1,000 years ago, there's a hiatus, and about 1,000 years ago, the soil texture changes is when people are coming back into this region and then changing the landscape above, planting trees, that we're getting Ferguson Island obsidian coming up in situ about 1,000 years ago. We had Bill Dickinson look at the pottery. We did probe work as well. I looked at it and I thought, well, it's got calcareous inclusions. It's probably local. But Bill did the thin sections. He said, no. He said there's terrigenous material in this that does not come from coil, does not come from Vocchio, and is no way comparable to any of the assemblages along the north coast that he had examined, Areté and so on. Nowhere comparable to Manos that he'd examined, or the Bismarck Archipelago material, nothing like it. He says probably from the coast, anywhere from Wewak all the way up to the far western coast of the main island of New Guinea. He couldn't pinpoint it. You've got to realize that mainland New Guinea across in Wewak have rivers draining through major complexes where they're metamorphic, volcanic, you name it, it's sedimentary, it's all there. They're mixed up with calcareous inclusions. This stuff was quite distinct, but it wasn't from coil. And it is 3,100 to 3,000 years old. And we're getting obsidian from these lowest levels. Not much, a handful. And they're from Manus, and they're from West New Britain. So we're getting a signature of occupation of pottery being used here, with obsidian coming in. And this is the type of signature that we would expect from this high energy environment from the north coast. And you get what you're given. But I would like to go back and have a look at Way and some of the other islands, and also go back to Vocchio. Vocchio will be disturbed. It's a high volcanic island, but at least do a bit more work around those areas. I should point out, this region's hardly unknown. Paul Gorecki and Wal Ambrose visited Coil in the 1980s, and apart from that, not much has been done on these offshore islands or the north coast. Sue O'Connor had a project on one of our ARC grants working up at Vanimo and areas to the west. There hasn't been much else work up there. Thirdly, let's have a look at pottery from mainland New Guinea. Now, I should also point out, before we go any further, that when we look at New Guinea today, we forget that the mighty Sepik River in the past was an inland sea. And thanks to the brilliant work of the late John Chappell and also Pam Swadling to hypothesize and reconstruct these ancient shorelines going back 6,000, 3,000 years. But we do need more work on this and reconstructing how far this inland sea extended. My guess is it probably extended a lot further. One of the early German geographers, Fuhrmann, who published a book in the 1890s that we've just translated and available from the Archaeology at Otago University website for free in English, said that when he was going up the Ewart River, no, not the Ewart, the Karam, he was going up the Karam River, towards the end when he came to the mountains, they were just raised mountains of limestone. And he predicted then that there was an inland sea. And John Chappell and Pam were able to confirm that with their research and well-published material. But we need more. We need more work to reconstruct this particular inland sea, because this is incredibly important in looking at the finds that we've got. Now, the first cab of the rank is the site of Wonalek. Wonalek is well into the interior at around 2,000 meters, 1,1700 meters above sea level. First excavated by the late Susan Bulmer in the early 1970s. And she argued that it was just over, oh gosh, she gave an early date, 3,500 or something. Tim Denham subsequently was able to go through the chronology, and with Anne Ford and Dylan Gaffney reanalyzed the pottery, and Dylan did the chemical analysis on it. We had Bill Dickinson do the petrographic analysis, and we confirmed the antiquity was probably around 3,000, 2,900, probably 3,000 for the earliest pottery. This is the Callum area today. The Callum have a oral history of going back about 6 generations. A remarkable place to work in, extremely remote, but a remarkable place. The community is fantastic. I should point out to people that to work in New Guinea, you need permission from the national government, and to get that, you need it from either the museum or the University of Papua New Guinea. You need written permission from the National Research Institute, and then they will confirm that you have affiliations with the museum or the university. You need permission from the local provincial government and the local community. So it's a quite complex pattern, but it works, and it works well. And we also bring PNG students with us into the field. And it's got to work like that because cultural heritage in many countries is extremely important, and you've got to regulate it. And PNG has very strong regulations. Well, the geochemical analysis using the scanning electron microscope and also the petrographic analysis confirmed that the pottery from Wanalek came from a number of sources. The results were compared to modern manufacturing areas on the coast and also the Eastern Highlands. It did not correspond. A couple looked like they were from the coast, but the majority had pretty much eroded, how do we explain it? They had eroded quartz, mica schist, feldspar, basically came from a metamorphic environment. This area has only one region where that could have happened, and that's on the southern slopes of the mountainous Sepik. So the area, either the early pottery, either came from the coast or came to the north of Wanalek on the other side of the mountains in the Sepik region, where you had a metamorphic underbelly. More on this later. This is extremely important. We published this in +1. The next site is Kawakau Cerebra, just north of Timbunki. This is an important site, originally excavated by Paul Gorecki. It was re-excavated by Andrew Fairburn and Jeff Hope as part of a larger project, an ARC project that involved coil. And Andrew and Jeff went down, they excavated it, they sent the pottery across to Otago, and Lucy Northwood, one of my students under my direction, analysed it. And these dates here, probably about 2,900, the pottery all came, just like Wanalek, came from these metamorphic mica schists, these strained quartz pieces. The geologist from Otago who did the thin sections suggested that it came from these metamorphics on the southern Sepik ranges. I went to Professor Hugh Davies, the doyen of geologists at PNG, and he confirmed that observation, that it's the only area it could have come from. Now, this would have been right on the edge of that ancient Sepik Sea. The next example, Moonup Camp from the Simbai Valley. Simbai Valley is just near the Kronk Valley, Western Madang. We have an article in Press, Pathway to the Interior, Human Settlement in the Simbai Kronk Valleys of Madang. It's in Press in Australian Archaeology by Dr. Judith Field, Dr. Ben Shaw and myself. And in Moonup Camp is one of the many sites that was excavated. We have pottery dated to 2850 to 2720. Again, metamorphic origins, quartz and or feldspar mica schist, the southern Sepik ranges. So here we have Wanalek, although Wanalek does have evidence of 1 or 2 shoots coming from the coast, but also coming from this southern Sepik ranges. Kawakau Cerebra, which would have been an island in the inland sea. It's on a raised area, 2,800. Moonup Camp, the same. What we're looking at here is a series of different interactions from the metamorphics coming into the interior, coastal coming up, and notice the Ramu River. these corridors, these pathways into the interior. Now, Paul Gorecki wrote a brilliant book called Crack in the Spine, which I was just looking at my copy today, where he argued that they're coming up the Hewitt into the interior. You've also got known trade links coming up from the Keram across the Schrader Mountains into Simbai, and also trade links coming up from Iome on the Ramu River coming up into the Simbai area. I want to talk more about this in a minute as far as future directions of research is concerned. But what we've got here, the sum of it, is we have pottery being brought up into the highland region, where the majority of it is made on the southern seepic slopes, which would have been near an inland sea at this time. The other point I want to make, which is also critical in understanding what it's doing up there, is that when you look at a consumption site of a Lapita site in the Bismarck Archipelago, you're looking at tens of thousands of bits of pottery, large settlements. Here at Wanalek in the earliest levels, at Moonup Camp in the Simbai, and Cerebra, or Kawakau, near Timbunki, we're finding handfuls, little bits of pottery. So this is not a production site, and my guess is it's not a very high consumption site. And my guess is the pottery is probably being exchanged or taken up and traded. But that can give us some clues as to the nature of interaction occurring between the coast, the interior sea, and the highlands. And my guess is I'd like to spend more time looking at those areas in the southern seepic slopes. Now, we're quite lucky because the French team, along with Matthew Leversley, is doing just that now with some brilliant work, not fully published, but a couple of papers out looking at some of the rock shelters along these river systems leading up into the highlands. And they've got Roxanne Sang from New Ireland doing her PhD in Queensland on rock art from this region. So some exciting research going ahead in this area. But I'd be keen to go and actually have a look at some of these areas and some of these communities. They still make pottery today, non-Austronesian groups that have come in relatively recently archaeologically, but the clays, there's only one area, I think, from the, from memory, from May and Tuxton, from the Hewitt that actually adds the inclusions with the clay. The others are naturally gritty, but my guess is that the grittiness is coming from these metamorphics coming into these clay areas. So this area warrants a lot more attention. So where do we go from here? Well, I suppose we look at the future, and the future is in a beautiful non-COVID world. I have a new project funded by the Royal Society of New Zealand, and it's a joint project between myself and Anne Ford, the National Museum and Art Gallery at Papua New Guinea, along with Professor Peter Matthews of Minpaku in Osaka, Patrick Roberts from the Max Planck Institute in Jena in Germany, Hermine Schaffler, who I believe is now in Spain. And the project is looking at what's called the Crossing the Divide from Asia to the Pacific, understanding colonization gateways into the Pacific. And what we argued was we still have these major gaps, particularly on the island of New Guinea. And there's consensus that the Austronesians bypassed it on their way to remote Oceania. But like this presentation, we pointed out that there are different new proxies to demonstrate that there is a presence, or an Austronesian presence, being felt related to this inland sea and trade links up into the interior. So what we argued for the project was to refocus archaeological attention to northeastern New Guinea to look at its role and impact on the expansion of Pacific peoples. And we would do this by focusing on an area critical in assessing the nature of Austronesian occupation. And this is the lower and middle Ramu River system that bordered the inland sea between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. We know nothing of this region. Evidence of Austronesian occupation through pottery manufacture is now known, as we've argued in this paper today. The Ramu River would have been an important conduit linking the coastal and inland regions when the sea existed. It's our task to find the link. The proposal builds on what we know and also the extremely important work of Pamela Swadling, who spent nearly 30 years in Papua New Guinea undertaking important archaeological work. And her work on the Lower Ramu is extremely important. There's also pottery found from Kainantu in the Eastern Highlands, excavated by Watson and Cole, actually excavated by Cole, and written up by Watson and Cole. It has been dated by Huff to 3,200 years old. This is important. I don't know anything about the thin sections or the chemical analysis. I don't think it's been done, where the pottery was manufactured or where it came from. We just don't know. Furthermore, recent discoveries that we've discussed from the Simbai Valley, the Middle Sepik, all point with one elect to a common origin for the bulk of the pottery somewhere in the southern Sepik mountains, in this metamorphic belt. I also should say that many years ago, I looked at Pam's pottery from the Lower Ramu, which is the Berry and Akari. They were found in the upper deposits, so probably about 3,000 years old to 2,500. Pam can pick me up if I'm wrong, but some of those were full of mica, very similar to the material that we're finding from the metamorphics to the west. This is an image of the Ramu River, and what we want to do is to go to Iome and Atembly and Annenberg and start to survey the region and also undertake coring to identify the extent of this inland sea, and then of course radiocarbon dating it. It's an extensive multidisciplinary project that we got funded for, and unfortunately with COVID, we haven't been able to get up there. And we have 2 scholarships, one for a PhD and one for a master's, which has already been earmarked for Papua New Guineans to come down to Otago. But again, with the COVID world, we're treading water. That's where we're going. I'd like to thank the National Museum and Art Gallery of New Guinea, the National Research Institute of New Guinea, the provinces of the East Sepik and Madang, the communities of Coil, the Karonk and Simbai valleys, particularly the late Herman Mandui, Alois Quazo, the ex-deputy director of the National Museum, Kenneth Miamba, the archaeologist at the National Museum, who hopefully will be bringing down to Otago, Sir Peter Barter, who facilitated a lot of our research in Madang, Tepsi Benny, Matthew Leavesley from the University of Papua New Guinea, Andy Fairburn from the University of Queensland, Jeff Hope, Emeritus Professor at the ANU, Lucy Northwood, who did the chemical analysis of the Cerebra pottery for her 4th year thesis, James Scott, the geologist from Otago University, who we work closely with in all our geological observations, and the late Bill Dickinson. Thanks to the Marsden Fund, the Australian Research Council, Judy Field, of course, Ben Shaw, Dylan Gaffney and Anne Ford in particular, plus our respective institutions. And I should put a big thanks to Professor Hugh Davies, again, the doyen of our geologists. Everywhere we work closely with geologists to point us in the right direction. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. It's presented some new results. Some of them are impressed. Some of them will be published soon, hopefully this year. But it does, to me, bring out the necessity to focus more on Papua New Guinea. And we don't have many people working there at the moment. On the South Coast, I think we've got Bryce Barker working up in the interior, and we have other people from Monash working on the South Coast. But on the North Coast, we have very few. The other thing that rings true is that recently we've been modelling, not recently, for a while we've been modelling late Pleistocene, early Holocene subsistence strategies and change over time. And I have students working on this at the moment, but we're always constrained by the fact that we only have less than 5 sites that we base our data on. 2 of those were dug by the late Sue Bormer. One of those pretty much nearly 60 years ago. And it's because we don't have people working in New Guinea. We don't have people working up in the interior of New Guinea. And there's only a handful of us working up there. And we really do need to get more people working up there, working with the PNG institutions, and with those institutions training the next generation of archaeologists. Matthew Leversley at the University of Papua New Guinea is doing this successfully now with a number of students studying overseas, and he should be congratulated on his effort. It's something that we all need to do for the future. On that note, my voice is going, so I'd like to thank everybody and hand the reins back to Alfred.
Oh, thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for this wonderful presentation and for bringing us closer to the amazing places and the sites of Papua New Guinea. I really enjoyed it, and also in the beginning, the maps that you showed that reminded me again. I mean, I'm working on coastal sites and deal with maritime environments and crossing the sea, but I'm a landlubber and I grew up in the mountains. So I was always wondering, how can we imagine this? How can we imagine the nautical skills that the navigating the people did? And as you said, not just going one way, but actually maintaining lines of communication over great distances.
Well, like you, I'm a landlubber, although I was brought up in Sydney, 30 miles in from the coast. So my connections to the sea is only when I used to get thrown into the ocean by my brothers. We learned to all swim at an early age in the early 60s. It's something that I realized working in the remote islands, particularly with Chris Gosden and people like Jim Specht, who I worked with, particularly Jim Specht, who was one of my early teachers, that the sea was a highway for many of these people. And Roger Green had a statement once, the late Roger Green, that I'll never forget. He said, you know, there's not a bit of real estate in the Pacific that people haven't visited, which means that they had great seafaring techniques. Despite what you'll hear to the contrary, colonization is the ability to get to a place and then come back again to get more people. It's a two-way process. And this would have also applied 50,000 years ago or more when people colonized Sahel, Australia and New Guinea. But not everybody was a sailor. The islands I work on, there are sailors. There are people who go out fishing and so on. But these people are also trained by their clans or their family. And they had special, what's the word for it? They're trained early about special magic and special ritual that they would have to perform. I remember I was talking about to some sailors on Ambitley Island, and they were talking about the trips they made in these large mons in the 1950s or 60s, I think the last mon was, these large plank-built canoes to islands of Tanga or mainland New Ireland. And they said that, I said, so when would you go? And they said, we went at night. And I said, why did you travel by mon at night? And they said, well, we had the road map above us, traveling by the stars, and the indicators of land by birds or twigs in the ocean, these old hints that we've heard and we've read about with Polynesian voyages. But the fact remains, as Roger Green said, every bit of real estate in the Pacific had been discovered before Europeans set foot in the Pacific. So these are people well attuned at living at home in the sea, something that I am not. I'm learning to live on the sea. I'm now learning to read a bloody weather map to make sure the seas are nice and flat. Most weather maps I've looked at don't make sense anyway. Yeah, I'm a landlubber like you, but I travel by boat when I have to, and I get from A to B. Once I'm on the island, I love it. But getting there by boat, you do what you do. I don't suffer from seasickness, and I've been in horrendous seas, and I'm very lucky to survive. So's the boatman with me. But we make it, and we get there. But let's not forget, even today, people go missing. And that's because they're using motorized boats. They don't use the traditional boats of sail. And a lot of them basically don't have the family skills that have been taught from generation to generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite the same. I have, fortunately, I'm not getting seasick myself. I'm recently, I became the co-owner of a bunker, which we thought we can use to reach our site on Ilin Island in Mindoro, and that was, and then the pandemic came, and we never really used it for that purpose. But yeah, that's as far as it goes from my side.
A great sailor. One of the great sailors we have is Jeff Irwin, Professor Jeff Irwin, who during the Lapita Homeland project of the 1980s took his own yacht and sailed up there. So he's written a book on the colonization of the Pacific with his skill as a sailor and winds put into it. Cambridge University Press. That's a good book for a landlubber to read.
Yeah, I should look into that. I just see always Peter Lay posting photos of his yacht and his boat trips on Facebook. But yeah, it's quite amazing, and something that we probably still, or many of us still have to realize, that it's not just a one-way voyage, and that this maritime travels even over very long distances. They can go, and they went 2 ways, and they went back and forth, and they had very good control over what they were doing, how they were using this highway. And that's quite amazing, and it explains some of those finds that what you mentioned, the obsidian, for instance, that appears over large and gets transported over large distances. We have that case with obsidian also, just the same way, very small numbers, not many pieces, but they appear in our site. They appear in Mindoro. They appear in Palawan, both places that don't have any obsidian sources. We had them also tested with PXRF. That was a nice project with Christian Rebmeier a few years ago. And all we know, it doesn't come from anywhere near the Philippines. It must have come from a faraway source. We haven't identified the source. And who knows that the obsidian is from the late Pleistocene, terminal Pleistocene, or early Holocene. So the location might be even underwater. We just don't know. But we know that it came from a very large distance. And I think one of Christian's guesses was actually also New Britain, as far as New Britain. And after seeing what you presented, I would be surprised, really.
I'll send you a paper that Atul Anderson and I wrote for Asian Perspectives some years ago. We found a wasted axe in the southern Ryukyus, and we wrote a paper about possible connections between this region and the Pacific as a whole. And the paper doesn't go anywhere, but there's a nice discussion about these connections of the past that we really don't explore very often. And there's some fascinating work going on now about language movements, for instance, from mainland China going across up the Ryukyus and in other regions as well. As far as the obsidian is concerned, I mean, the earliest obsidian going out to the east with the early colonizers are quite large chunks. It means that they're getting quite a quantity of it. And Peter Shepard's work has been brilliant on this, that they're actually going and getting the sources directly with them. They're not going down through a down-the-line exchange network. That does occur, but only with later Lapita networks, where over time the obsidian gets minute because it's being chopped all the way down, reduced. But the early colonists are bringing out large quantities, and we see it also in southwest New Britain. So that's indicating that you have got this highly interactive network over thousands of kilometers. It had been argued that people sail into the wind so they can always turn around and come back. But I think the initial colonization of Lapita, if we did some modeling years ago about the numbers of people, and unless you brought in tens of thousands of people, what you're looking at are very small mobile groups of people moving around the landscape, changing some of the islands, planting some of their material, like a ready teller coming back at a later time. and then traveling these great distances. And we see this in the similarity in the ceramic design between New Ireland, New Britain, and the early material in Tonga, let alone Fiji. So it's a much more highly interactive community than we see today. The early models argued that once Lapita got beyond Vanuatu in the Fiji, then the whole world separated and we had a separate East and a separate Western Lapita. That doesn't hold true anymore. When people are getting across to these regions, they're still interacting for some period of time, because we're getting Obsidian still getting to Fiji well after the first colonization. Jeff Irwin's work at Guinea demonstrates that. So it's an interesting area. Now, if they're getting from the Bismarck Archipelago 3,000 kilometers across to Fiji and further east, then if they go to the northwest, I mean, the Philippines isn't that far by traveling.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I always wondered, and you showed those so many wonderful photos of amazingly decorated pottery, really pieces of art with their beautiful decoration, and they were not just, or many were not just, or not at all utilitarian objects. And I wondered why don't we find similarly or any really decorated pottery in the Philippines?
Well, you do find some in the Cagayan Valley. I remember going to, over 20 years ago, going up to Sophia University and having a look at Aoyagi's material. And Tanaka wrote a PhD on it. And I'm looking at very similar material. Xiao Shunhong's work in the Cagayan Valley as well. I'm looking at pottery very similar. So there are connections there. And, when I first saw Aoyagi's collection at Sophia, 2002-3, I couldn't believe it. I thought, where's this stuff been? But then he gave me these publications written in Japanese and a couple of monographs by Ogawa, which I didn't know existed, that has them all there. So unlike the north coast of New Guinea, I mean, Philippines must have more low inert environments where things can be deposited. And, the ancestors had to pass through this region, has to be somewhere. I wish you and your colleagues all the best.
Thank you. I hope so. And I hope that we won't have to wait that much longer before we can go back to the field. You just mentioned Xiao Chun-Hung, and I noticed she's here in the audience. And maybe if she likes, she could join our discussion.
Thank you.
To have you here.
Enjoy your talk very much, and thanks.
Thank you very much.
How is
That's the
everything?
problem with Zoom, it can be very unexpected.
Yeah, sorry for the ambush.
Actually, Mike is here too. Mike.
It's great seeing you both here.
Yeah, that's right. We have a message from Mike in the
Yeah.
chat box. Aido, right?
Yes, we do have a message from Mike Carson. He's sending his regards. He says, so thank you, Professor Summerhayes, for sharing your information and comprehensive summary. The research about the Sepik Inland Sea is important, and your next findings here will be most interesting. Congratulations on all of the good work and the results.
Thank
That's
you very
from
much.
Mike Carson.
Thank you. I should point out too, as I said in my talk, that the results that I presented are due to a lot of people's efforts as well that I've worked with. And I'd just like to see it continue. One of my ex-students just finishing his PhD in Cambridge has now got a postdoc in Oxford, Dylan Gaffney. He's been working off the islands off the western part of New Guinea in Indonesia. And, I mean, the future is in people in his hands, Ben Shaw's hands, Matt Leaversley and others. But we do need to get more young people working up in this region because there's a paucity of people working there. And, people forget Papua New Guinea has a population of nearly 10 million people. Mm-hmm. That's just Papua New Guinea. And it's got, nearly 1,000 languages. And so it has a rich history. And there's great academics in Papua New Guinea. There's great young archaeologists in Papua New Guinea. But it's great to get more international collaboration with them to build and cement a future for them and the archaeology there. If not, these questions will never be asked. They'll never be answered either.
Yeah, but it's wonderful that it is such a dynamic environment for archaeological research now, and of course, definitely the sites, the potential has always been there, and I'm happy to hear that so much is going on, and also that you have now this new project, the Crossing the Divide project. I'm also happy to see
we've also got, sorry,
Armin of Lehrer working with you there. Yeah.
Oh, it's great having her there. The other thing too is there's more work on the south coast. Anne Ford from Otago has been working on sites just west of Port Moresby, looking at trade and exchange for the last 1,000, 1,500 years. And Rob Skelly from Monash is doing brilliant work on the south coast as well. But like us, he's restricted by COVID. He just can't get up there, and it's causing a problem. But multidisciplinary projects are the way to go, and I'm hoping that those people that do work with us in New Guinea can also impart some of those skills back into New Guinea, which I think is important.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, that was quite a learning experience today. So I admit I haven't been really that much involved with the archaeology of New Guinea. I know of a few bits and pieces like early stone adzes, which something that interests me from coming from my own research and specialization. But there's so much more, and there's so much going on. So it's really wonderful to see and to experience. So thanks again for being with us and for presenting all this amazing research. May I ask Ado again, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, one just actually came in from Mr. Verney. He asks, he is interested in plant distribution, and one of this Acalypha, something known as the copper leaf. It is an ornamental and was named after the wild expedition in Fiji. It is purported that early settlers brought them in from New Guinea and indicate that this plant, among others, have cultural importance to the settlers. How extensive is this plant introductions in the cultural and practice of these settlers slash migrants? He is talking about the copper leaf.
I'm probably the worst person to ask that question to with plants. That's why I have Professor Peter Matthews on the project. We know that some of the major food crops came with people to the east, probably Artocarpus as well, breadfruit, coconut, the domestic coconut, which I published on. But this particular plant, I'm unfamiliar with it. But if you like, I can ask Peter Matthews. I'd be interested in the answer because a lot of there are proxies of interactions and things being brought across. And if this is an example of one that's been brought across from New Guinea, then I'd be interested to know about it. So thank you for your question, and I will follow it up and get back to you. If you can send me your email, I'll follow it up.
Thank you very much, Dr. and Professor Summerhayes.
Thanks. I have a very silly question, if I may ask. What does Lapita mean, actually? Where does the name come from?
Well, it came from Gifford and Shuttler when they excavated on the west coast of New Caledonia in the early 1950s. And they got a radiocarbon date from Walter Libby in Chicago. Radiocarbon dating is only a couple of years old, and they got a date of around 3,000 years. And this demonstrated that there's a time depth in the Pacific. Prior to that, no one really knew. And Lapita technically is supposed to have been their local community that it was found. But Christoph Sand has other stories about they mixed up the pronunciation with the local community and so on, the Japita or whatever. But Gifford put it down as Lapita and the word stuck.
So it was just that. That's interesting that you mentioned the early radiocarbon dates made by Lippi and his lab. We learned about it during a review of Philippine chronology and absolute dating, and it turned out that Lippi and his laboratory did actually a lot of very early radiocarbon dating in the Asia Pacific area, like also Robert Fox and Tabon caves that was dated already in the early 60s. And it's quite amazing to see that the region was actually one of the pioneering regions for radiocarbon dating.
It was extremely important. I've just written an article for a handbook of Papua New Guinea in Australia. And the article I wrote was on the history of archaeology in New Guinea up until 1960. On mainland New Guinea, the work of Sue Bulmer, 60 years ago, with some of the earliest radiocarbon dates, gave a time depth that no one had ever imagined. The same in Australia, the dates for Kenneth Cave in 65, no one imagined the time depth. And now, of course, we go back over 60,000. In the Pacific, what time depth? And to have a time depth of 3,000 years completely revolutionized the way time was seen and the interrelationship between these ancient communities. So major, major advances in the way we see the past. The past was actually, that extra dimension was given to us by radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because many think that absolute dating and radiocarbon dating is something that was just relatively recently not established but widespread. But no, it's really one of the earliest regions where radiocarbon dating was successfully conducted and changed a lot of the picture.
Yeah, Gifford and Shuttler's their monograph from Berkeley in California on the New Caledonian material came out in the 50s. That has the radiocarbon dating in it, so it was quite early.
Mm, right. I think we have another question.
Yes, we do. It's from Mr. John Pancho. He says, "Good afternoon, Dr. Glenn. You mentioned about pottery shards from PNG possibly being used for ritual purposes in your talk. May I ask what similarities in ritual, religion, etc. have you seen between the locals of your research sites and Filipinos, especially given the cultural genealogy?"
Well, in New Ireland and most of New Britain, ceramics haven't been made for 2,000 years. So local groups don't use them. Manus made pottery that was exchanged down. Pottery was made in Buka, the North Solomons, that was traded up to some of the island groups, but all used for cooking. From New Britain, West New Britain, pottery was made in a number of locations on the mainland and used for cooking only. So as far as local people are concerned, the pottery hasn't been made in some of these consumption areas of New Ireland and New Britain for well over 2,000 years or more. So I can't really talk about Filipino research and locals and pottery. I just don't know it. I know a bit about the Nassabaran material, but Xiao Shunhung is the expert on that. But no, the locals in New Guinea, pottery is something different to them. And those that do have it in the west coast of West New Britain import it in from mainland New Guinea, and near don't use it at all. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was on Ateneo, I think it was 95, I was on Babassi Island, and I found a rock shelter, and it had a broken pottery sherds. And I thought, wow, this stuff looks identical to material from the Massam, southeast Papua. wow, this is incredible. I wonder if there's any connection. It can't be. And the more questions I asked, I found out that in actual fact, it had nothing to do with archaeology. The community next door, one of the women is from the Massam, and she married into the local community and brought a pot with her. And when it broke, she dumped it into the rock shelter. So, but no, I can't really answer your question. As I said, ceramics aren't being made. And even then in Lapita times, we can only assume or indirectly assume that the dentate ceramics are mostly bowls and stands, and they have a quick tempo in a change over time, with the stands and bowls dropping out and the dentate changing. Whereas the planeware and the linear inciseware, they don't change much at all. So we're inferring that these are non-utilitarian wares. They're not used for normal cooking. And the labor intensity on it, we found a couple of pieces of pottery, one in particular that was a clay modeled head that had tattooing on the nose, a circle on the forehead, and tattooing here. 3,300 to 3,100. Robin Torrance also published an article in one of the Lapita proceedings of tattooing on pottery of the face. And this is something that may be connected with its ancestry further to the west. I honestly don't know. But the dentate ceramics was labor intensive. I found pottery from the Aretés that was identical to material that Pat Kirch found from Musau on the other side of the Bismarck archipelago. It's as if the same person made them. So they have strong clan designs, strong social relationships. And all the pottery that we found, this dentate pottery, is found from a number of different clays, a number of different mineral fillers, indicating that people are highly mobile, moving around, picking up a clay here, a mineral filler here, and yet producing identical pottery. Now, if you're a potter, most potters are anally retentive. They're one way and one way only of doing it. They mix the pottery clay with pottery temper and they fire it a certain way. Here we have potters changing the technology. Every time they use a different mineral filler or a sand filler or a clay filler, changing the technology, changing the firing to produce identical pottery all over the Bismarck archipelago with exactly the same designs, these 500 motif designs, very similar going out to the Solomons as well. But these are basically clan designs, community designs, social designs of place and community moving around the landscape. Over time, towards the middle Lapita and late Lapita, that's not happening. Pottery is mostly local, but mostly standardized where you'd see today in a specialized village. So this early pottery is highly mobile, highly indicative of interaction occurring. And my guess is people are moving around the landscapes. The same people from Musau are coming down to the Aretés and coming across to other regions, even going across to Fiji and back. It's an environment that we haven't seen for thousands of years. Sorry, I've deviated a bit on that. It's a hypothesis.
Thank you so much, Professor Summerhayes.
May I ask another question? And my apologies that it's plant related again. You mentioned for Coil Island, for instance, you mentioned that there was the presence of canarium nuts in a terminal Pleistocene layers. What does that mean?
Well, Doug Yang did work on canarium on mainland New Guinea. He did DNA work on it. And he said it probably originated from mainland New Guinea. And his hypothesis was that if it is not found on mainland New Guinea, i.e. in the Bismarck archipelago, it could well have been brought in by people. We have canarium in Manus, I think I forget the date in Manus. We have canarium in Manus. Manus is 500 kilometers away. So I think what you've got here is a translocation of canarium by people. Coil Island is the highest part of the island. There's a very likely chance that it was brought by people and planted there rather than being naturally distributed. Now, others might disagree with that, but it is found in an archaeological site. It is burnt, so people used it, and it is about 12 or 13,000 years old. We haven't published that yet, but we should. But it's important because it's one of the oldest evidence of canarium in Papua New Guinea. And my guess is the Coil Island is a stopover point to get across up to Manus. We know that the Manus Tru, the traders that lived on the offshore islands to the south of Manus, came to the north coast of New Guinea all the time. I mean, we have pottery from Manus going back a couple of thousand years on mainland New Guinea. Coral Island has pottery from Manus going back 3,000. So people are moving up and down from Manus to mainland New Guinea. If you're going to have a pit stop, Coral is the place to have it, or Vokyo or one of the other areas. So I think that's what it means. People are just stopping there on their way and bringing the Canarium in. Definitely used the 13,000.
That makes it a wonderful marker for those movements. We have early Canarium in one of our sites on Ilin Island, directly dated. Was one of our first radiocarbon dates directly dated to between 10,700 and 11,100 or so. But then Ilin Island was at that time connected to the main island of Mindoro, so the Canarium did not have to go very far. But we are quite sure that the Canarium was used as well. Yeah. Okay, do we have more questions?
Fortunately, we do not have questions anymore, even in the lives.
Okay. Well, but we are just on time. It's 3:29, so perfect. Thank you very much, Glenn. It was really wonderful having you with us. It's a well-befitting ending of this semester's webinar series. So that was our last webinar for this semester, but everyone stay tuned. We will, of course, continue and we will have similarly outstanding, exceptional archaeologists and anthropologists presenting next year. But for now, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Professor Glenn Summerhayes.
Thank you for having me, Alfred. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you and all your colleagues the best and have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, you too. Merry Christmas.